Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. And this is for a class for Tuesday, May 12th, our last class before the final examination. So, our final will be on Thursday. What I will do is I will post our final at the time at which our class would normally meet, which would be at 10 a.m. And you have 24 hours in which to respond to that final. That will mostly be devoted to poetry, and you will have some choice of essay questions. And I certainly don't expect an essay that is as developed or well written as what you might do with a paper, but you still should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, be able to talk about some of the points that we've been discussing about poetry. That's 80 points of the final examination, which leaves two shorter essay questions, both 10 points each, one for the fiction section and one for the drama section. And since this is also a film class, amongst the choices you would have to write about would be both either literature or film. But you'll see that when you see the examination. And Thursday is the last day in which you could submit in paper number 2 if you haven't already done so, and any revisions that you might have done to paper number 1. So we have 3 poems today to finish off our poetry section, and they're all in one way or another about America, but they all take very different perspectives about America. Before I start getting into the actual poetry itself, you'll see in the notes below that I have included a link for Dead Poets Society, which I had forgotten to do when we were talking about Dead Poets Society. So if you wanted to read the screenplay, you could do so. I had provided a link for Citizen Kane for the very same reasons. I didn't provide links for the dramas because the dramas are a little bit trickier. Ultimately, the dramas are based on actual text. So you've got either the actual text or the performance, one or the other. So, in terms of America, by Allen Ginsberg, written in 1956, I wanted you to get some exposure to the beat poets that are very controversial. And these were a group of poets that were writing in the 50s and in the 60s, starting out in Northern California, Berkeley to be exact. And they basically questioned everything about how poetry had been done up until that point. So the idea was that their poetry would be a stream of consciousness poetry. In other words, it would mimic the thought patterns that we have, which don't necessarily make sense, which are oftentimes filled with fragments and run-ons, which oftentimes are not necessarily obviously connected to each other, that oftentimes might make sense only to us as the individual, and oftentimes we think things that are not socially acceptable or considered to be socially acceptable. Nothing was off limits. So you could talk about sex, and you could talk about drugs, and you could be critical of the government and religion and all authoritarian institutions. And usually people end up in one of two camps when it comes to the beat poets. Either they hate the beat poets, talking about how they are self-indulgent and they're crude, rude, lewd, or the exact opposite, that finally we've got a poetry of truth in all of its raw ugliness. And what I have are two readings for you to listen to of Allen Ginsberg. The first was a reading that he did in front of a live audience of a draft. So he was not yet done with his poem. You'll see that there are many changes that he made to the final version of the poem. And the reason why I wanted you to listen to this is not only to listen to his tone, which might be kind of surprising. It's quite sarcastic and even humorous, but I also wanted you to listen to the audience's response. And he was delivering to a Berkeley, California audience, so they love the poem, as you can tell. And there are all kinds of pieces of irony in the poem. For instance, when he talks about that he'll never be able to get a teaching job. Well, Ginsberg was a professor of English at UC Berkeley, one of the top universities in the nation for literature studies. Ginsberg's biography is just as complicated as his writing. He was known for active drug use. He was known for being in and out of mental institutions. He was known for being openly gay in a time where individuals didn't necessarily discuss that. He had some unusual ideas about lowering the age of consent for sexual activity. And he comes with a lot of baggage. There's no way around that. But I wanted you to be exposed to his style of writing because when you listen to it the second time, this is going to be a studio recording. And in this studio recording, we've got the final version, and you can see that the tone is very different. It's much more serious, it's much more reflective. We are going to get lots of topical references in beat poems, especially this particular poem, America. Most of those references are to things that Ginsberg feels are injustices that are going on at the time period. And there are lots of ways that you could modernize this poem. At one point, he says, "This is the impression I get from looking at the television set." This is his commentary on media and how media is destroying society. We could easily substitute that with something like TikTok or cell phones. And when he talks about the idea of ultimately the poetry falling apart so that we've got this rambling, what sounds like nonsensical statements, the idea is that this is what America is as well. It's rambling, it's nonsensical. He continually goes back and forth questioning who or what is sane or insane. He continually goes back questioning whether or not the fault is with America or the fault is with Americans, and could he himself be responsible as an American. We see lots of questions in this poem, basically challenging us to a kind of debate. Tell me that I'm wrong. And he talks a little bit also about some of the fears of the time period. Things like, for instance, when he says everybody's a spy, and the idea of paranoia and McCarthyism that was going on during the time period. He talks about the mechanization of society, the factory workers that replace the artisans, and the result of that would be increased workload and less work satisfaction. And again, he does it in a very rude and crude way. He will use racial epithets. He will use profanity, as we see very early on when he says, "America, go fuck yourself with your atom bomb." And, of course, we know that a bomb is a phallic symbol. So there's lots of layers of meaning here. And I usually suggest that when you approach Ginsberg, that you think about it line by line. I know I've made a similar suggestion with Emily Dickinson. So, for instance, when he asks America, "When will you take off your clothes?" The idea of when will America show its truth? Or when can I go to the supermarket and buy what I need with my good looks? The idea of the superficiality of America. And sometimes he makes references that don't necessarily make sense. For instance, when he makes references to specific sums of money, they are small sums of money. Perhaps he's suggesting that's how much he owns, or how much is in his pocket or in his bank account, or this is how much he's valued as a citizen of America, or perhaps this is how much America is valued. When he talks about Uncle Max and coming back from Russia, I can't help but substitute words like Krebs coming back from Germany. Um, the idea that America presents itself as superior to other nations and blames outsiders, all of that is embedded within the poem. Now, there are other ways to go about critiquing that are softer and gentler, and that is our second poem, Coca-Cola and Coco Frio by Martin Espada. Now, Martin Espada, he has an interesting story as well. He's local, and he teaches English at UMass Amherst, and he oftentimes speaks locally. I encourage you all, if you have the opportunity, to listen to him. He's even spoken at GCC. He's an attorney initially, by trade, and was writing in his spare time. And his writing became so successful that basically he switched roles. So now he's writing and teaching full time, and he's practicing law. in his spare time. He is, as I am myself, Puerto Rican, and Puerto Rico has a very interesting history as well. It is a territory of the United States. You can think of it as a kind of colony. So it is part of the United States, but it's not part of the United States. It's an island, and it is tropical. And in Spanish, Puerto Rico means rich port because it's a place that's filled with abundance, and or at least it was. Right now, it has been gentrified, and a lot of political and social tensions about its status. Should it remain as a territory of the United States, which means there are tax breaks, particularly for large corporations that might be doing business there? Should it be an independent nation? After all, it has its own culture and its own language. Spanish is the primary language, English is the secondary language. Or should it be a full fledged state of the United States, comparable to Hawaii? And Puerto Rico is basically um, very similar to another island that we don't think of necessarily as an island, New York City. And even though New York City has been industrialized, it too is an island and divided up into sections. One of those sections, they're known as boroughs, is Brooklyn, which is where Martina Espada grew up. And there was a lot of basically immigration from Puerto Rico to New York in the middle 1900s. Puerto Ricans are citizens of the United States and can travel freely. And Martina Espada talks about what it means to be part of the United States, yet not part of the United States, and what it means to be visiting Puerto Rico when that is his cultural identity, yet he's visiting much like a tourist. And he talks about how his writing is often autobiographical. So this poem very much is about him as a young boy, who he references as a fat boy, that he was indeed fat. But it's also symbolic of the United States being fat and continually consuming, whether it's food and empty calories, such as Coca Cola, or whether it's just product and consumerism. And we can see by the title, Coca Cola and Coco Frio, we've got a contrast of two things. Coca Cola represents the United States. And basically, if we had to define Coca Cola, perhaps the most well known product on the planet, it's sugar water, unless we're using high fructose corn syrup. And it is unhealthy. And it is filled with empty calories, and it represents capitalism, and it represents industrialization, and it is the exact opposite of Coco Frio, which you may not necessarily know what that is, but it's defined in the poem that it basically is a coconut that's a green shell, which shows how fresh it is, and it's cracked open by a machete, and then you drink the clear milk with a straw. And that contrast is used throughout the poem to sort of illustrate the tension between Puerto Rico and the United States. I was able to find an audio of him reading the poem with only some slight differences. And in that audio, he talks a little bit about how he was writing about his own experiences and how, from his perspective, this is his poem about the assimilation that occurs, that cultures don't basically embrace their cultural heritage or the abundance that surrounds them. In this instance, Coca Cola, because when he goes to visit his family, they insist on speaking English rather than Spanish. And also, they sing to him in jingles that they really don't understand about Coca Cola. And they offer him Coca Cola, which is not what he wants. He wants his cultural identity, which is seen in Coco Frio, which he finds at a roadside stand by the beach, which is the exact opposite of where you would find probably Coca Cola, which would be in a supermarket in a can or some kind of plastic container. So we see the contrast of the two. And of course, the coconuts are supposed to bring forth imagery of breasts, talking about how the coconuts are unsuckled and heavy with milk at the very ending of the poem. The idea that Martin Espada is looking for his homeland, in effect. He's looking for his identity, his motherland, if you will. And I hope you can see that both authors are trying to do the same thing, but they do it in very different ways. And I know I've been a bit heavy handed with the 1900s. It happens to be the century in which I was born, but I knew that I would also have to give something from the 2000s. And that leads to our third and final poem, and that's called The Hill We Climb. Um, Before I get to that, Coca-Cola and Coco Frio, you'll probably hear Martina Spada giving a very musical reading to it. Spanish is a very musical language as opposed to English, which is very short and clipped. And if you ever see him perform, he tends to sway as well, which gives a musicality to his performance. But The Hill We Climb, the very last poem, we have not only audio, but we have video so that we can see Amanda Gorman's performance in 2021, which is how most people experienced that particular poem when it was delivered at the presidential inauguration for Joe Biden at his swearing in ceremony. And she was the youngest inaugural poet at age 21. Discovered by Joe Biden's wife, Jill Biden, who is a doctor in education, and her career was, because she just recently retired, a English professor at the community college level. When she heard Amanda Gorman's work in another context, she realized that this was brilliance and basically found a way to have Amanda Gorman present at a very tense swearing in ceremony, because if you'll remember, January 6th from 2021, depending on your perspective, some people call it a riot, some people call it a protest, but there were definitely questions about the succession of power. And that swearing in ceremony led to the first time, perhaps in American history, where there was a question about whether or not there would be a peaceful transfer of power. Something I had always taken for granted, to be quite honest with you. And you'll see in that video that Amanda Gorman is wearing this bright yellow coat. You know, she wanted to give a message of hope and optimism in her poem. And underneath that yellow coat is a bulletproof vest, as they were all wearing because of the possibility of assassination attempts. Luckily, nothing happened. And most of the people who first experienced this poem, like myself, experienced it through television or streaming. In other words, they heard it orally and they saw it. And then it was only after the fact that the text was released of the poem. And I've included a link to the text below, as well as I've included a video to her performing the poem. And it is a kind of performance, as you will see. And that's just as important, how she delivers this poem, as what she says within the particular poem. And I remember when I watched it, at the ending, I went to social media and I wrote, I've seen the future of poetry. Her name is Amanda Gorman. I was so impressed when she delivered The Hill We Climb. Lots of punning on the idea of hills because, of course, the January 6th incidents had occurred on Capitol Hill. But, of course, we were talking about, and she uses deliberately the pronoun we as in one peoples, have a hill to climb. And that said, there is an interview from Amanda Gorman that's approximately 25 minutes long that I would like you to see. And it is right before the last presidential inauguration. As you know, we live in very politically challenging times, where she talks a little bit about writing this poem in a very brief amount of time, by the way, because it was January 6th of that year that spurred her to write the poem. She talks a little bit about her current writing projects. She talks a little bit about how her poem has been banned for being divisive. And you can decide for yourself after reading and listening to the poem if you think it's divisive or not. And some of her political plans for the future. And once again, we have another poem that's talking about America, but rather than just critiquing it, offering perhaps the possibility of a new beginning, which seemed like a nice way to end the semester. So for our last attendance question, and this will be due on Thursday the 14th. Now that we have concluded our poetry section, which is your least favorite poem I've been asking you about your most famous or favorite poem. Which is your least favorite poem and why? So I leave you to watch Allen Ginsberg's two performances of America. I leave you to listen to Martina Spada's uh, reading of Coca-Cola and Coco Frio. And I leave you to watch Amanda Gorman's performance and subsequent interview afterwards about The Hill We Climb. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I will post the final next class. Take care. Bye bye.